Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the second session of the National Virtual Conference on Economic Dimensions in Judicial Decisions. I'm Srijit SG. I'm the Executive Dean of Jindal Global Law School. As part of the ongoing discussion on the various dimensions and possibilities of the economic analysis of law, our second session is themed Law and Economics Approach to Corporate Laws and Corporate Debt Restructuring in India. Our distinguished panel for the session include Ms. Pratibha Jain, Group General Counsel and Head of the Corporate Affairs, Everstone; Mr. Surendra Kanstia, Practicing Company Secretary and Fellow Kutch Center for Competition, Investment and Economic Regulation; Professor Dr. Ajay Shah, Research Professor of Business, Jindal Global Business School; Ms. Bhargavi Zaveri, Senior Researcher, Finance Research Group; and as the moderator of the panel, my colleague, Professor Shuchi Sinha, Professor of Legal Practice, Jindal Global Law School. I welcome everybody to the second technical session, and over to you, Professor Shuchi.
Thank you, Professor Srijit. It's my privilege, my pleasure to get this opportunity to be part of this event and to moderate this very distinguished panel. So I'll take this opportunity to start off with a little introduction about the themes of our discussion today, about the background, about the concept of this entire event and this discussion. And then we'll move ahead to this very exciting set of concepts and theories and questions that we'll be putting to the panelists, and then we'll see what they have to say on this. So, just to start our introduction into this entire theme and this concept, the idea behind today's event, what we want to really start off the basis of the discussion is that interface between law and economics in the domain of corporate and commercial laws in India is increasingly becoming more and more complex. That's understandable as we develop our legal and regulatory frameworks. Now, in addition to the existing regulators, you have your Ministry of Corporate Affairs, the Reserve Bank of India, you have Securities and Exchange Board of India, those classical regulators. We are also having new regulators like the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India that are being constituted to meet different needs as they are coming up in our very sort of fast-paced economy for many years now. So similarly, just as we have these new regulators to deal with different forms of commercial disputes, new dispute resolution, grievance addressal forums have also come up in the form of commercial courts, commercial divisions of high courts, and so on. And these have been set up in addition to existing bodies like our debt recovery tribunals. So what has happened is that these bodies are required to function in an environment where specialty or specialized experience or specialized knowledge is actually more of an exception rather than the rule. So additionally, these independent regulatory agencies also have to work in coordination with government departments, and presumably there would be some political interests and political sort of thoughts that go behind that coordination as well. So, and similarly, if you look at these expert dispute resolution bodies, they do function amidst these civil and existing constitutional courts that are overburdened by this very wide variety and spectrum of civil and criminal matters, right? In all this, in the background of all this, the government also continues to experiment with the jurisdiction of appellate tribunals, and that adds to these multiple layers of regulations, regulators, forums. So there is more and more of uncertainty with all these developments. Given that more often than not, the individuals managing all of these bodies would be coming from a pool of generalists, right? They would not necessarily be specialists. They would not necessarily have the domain expertise or the experience. So if we have an expectation from such bodies that they may perhaps break new ground, that may be a little far-fetched. But nevertheless, the operation of such different bodies related to commercial and corporate matters does have the potential to result in the development of divergent jurisprudence, right? And that will always, we have seen it in the past also, it will result in inconsistencies, in ambiguities. And if you look at the situation today, such inconsistencies, particularly if you have sensitive issues like corporate debt restructuring, you have a loan moratorium. Now we have had one going on for some time. And the scope of what the creditors can do, especially in light of this current pandemic situation, can have a very significant economic impact, can have an impact on the financial health of key stakeholders in our entire, economic ecosystem. So if we look at examples, for instance, the Supreme Court, which has allegedly been overstepping into the domain of the executive on various issues, recently it did refuse to interfere with the government and the RBI's decisions relating to moratoriums, for instance, loan moratoriums, and referred to it as a policy matter. But previously, the Supreme Court had prohibited classification of accounts as non-performing owing to the pandemic. So on that occasion, you could say it did step into what could be considered a policy matter. Then Supreme Court also ordered waiver of compound interest of all borrowers availing that loan moratorium. So in the past, RBI and central government have also differed with each other on the policy, for instance, regarding recognition of non-performing assets or the mechanisms to deal with them. And then if we think back, the Supreme Court had actually struck down a circular issued by the RBI, so that February 12 circular, for instance, on this very issue. So in light of all this, it's a very sort of constant developments going on. In light of all this, it's become very relevant to adopt a very coherent approach to law and economics in corporate and commercial matters to ensure that the interests of stakeholders are taken into account, so that there are appropriate capacities built into these various forum and these various regulatory systems to deal with these complex matters where economics and law are not necessarily separate. And we need this capacity to look at them in a holistic way, perhaps, or to be able to look at the interactions between these fields as well. So that was just a little, a background from my end, just to bring us into the far more exciting sort of next point in our event today. And that is to really get some insights from our very distinguished panel, to get their thoughts, to get their response on some of these matters. So I'm going to now move ahead and just put a few questions before our distinguished panel. I would request, as we come to you and we ask you a question, to try and have a nice detailed kind of discussion on it, and we'll try and keep each answer maybe between 3 and 4 minutes to the extent possible, of course. So let us now move ahead, and I will start by putting my first question to Ms. Pratibha Jain, right? So Ms. Pratibha Jain, I had, so the question that I really wanted to bring up to start off our discussion, and it's a slightly sort of a broad thematic question. It's a little bit of practicality and maybe the philosophy of law and economics coming in here. So if we think about it, a very important, a very key prerequisite to an economic analysis of law is to allow discretion, right? That opportunity to regulators, to quasi-judicial authorities to have that discretion to analyze. But, do you feel that such authorities have been able to use their discretion appropriately, particularly in commercial matters? We would love to hear your thoughts on this, Ms. Pratibha Jain.
Thank you, Professor Suchi. Actually, I am a financial markets lawyer. I'm not an academic, so I'm going to leave it to the academics to tell us, what the solutions are. What I will like to raise is the issues that the financial investors, and that's the area where I mostly work in, getting foreign investment into the country. The concern that it is increasingly becoming a problem in attracting foreign investors is the uncertainty in law. So there was a lot of talk about, retrospective amendments to regulations, which, the current government then said, as a policy that they will not make retrospective amendments. However, that is just one aspect of it. I think the uncertainty, and that uncertainty is the one word underlying, your brief of what you've just talked about in the Indian context, which is you don't know which authority or which court is going to interpret which regulation in what manner. It's as simple as that. So there is no certainty of law currently. And there's no underlying policy as investors that we can decipher in which way either ultimately the central government will look at it or the courts will look at it, right? So you have various financial regulators. It's a regulator's prerogative to have discretion. You cannot function an economy without giving some delegated legislation power to the regulators and to a certain extent, the quasi-judicial authorities, whether I put CCI in that bucket. However, that discretion has to be exercised. Let me quote Cutts paper itself. They say there are three justifications for regulatory intervention: prevention of market failure, restriction or removal of anti-competitive practices, and promotion of public interest. Now, when there is a discretion that is applied by a regulator in terms of, let's say, prevention of market failures, it'll be a broad policy like limitation. Today, we have a limitation in India on what the overall limit of corporate bonds that the private sector can raise. Above that, you have to go back to the RBI and get fresh limits. That's an overall market issue, and that's a policy discussion. And we don't we can argue on whether the market should be more open, not. But that is that falls in that bucket. Similarly, anti-competitive practices, both from a regulatory perspective, though, again, the private sector would prefer that if you've got a body like CCI and appellate bodies above it, you leave it to them, right? You've made the law for anti-competitive actions and you let that particular regulator to deal with it. But you still, sometimes when you have an amendment in foreign investment laws which says, okay, it's to ensure that there is a level playing field among players, you can still digest it. The problem comes, everything else falls in the bucket of public interest. And that overreach is so significant that in the private sector now, with the foreign investors, it's called the India risk. Just the uncertainty of how we have a law today, but how, just yesterday I was on a call where we were trying to explain to a real estate investor who's looking to make a huge investment, talk about we don't know how the courts are going to look at home buyers tomorrow as creditors. So we said, no, that issue is done with, yes, they intervened and allowed them to be financial creditors, the courts, but then, there's a 10% rule. The investors had a very good question. How do you know that the courts will not again take this project and say public interest and interpret again in a different manner what the policy in this regard is? So those kind of interventions, whether at a regulatory level or at the court level, is what is really killing business for now.
Correct.
I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, no, I think, the point is actually very well taken. The points that you were making it's a good point. That yes, the whole idea of having those regulators is, of course, that they need to have that discretion, but then there is a requirement, if we want that development of the legal framework to be in a way that genuinely encourages that investment or encourages that growth, that it needs to be perhaps consistent with economic principles a bit more. And, as you mentioned, that very often we sort of circle back to this point of public interest or what seems to be perhaps equitable to the regulator in that particular circumstance, as you mentioned, the home buyers being financial creditors, and we'll come to that in a later question. We do have, we want to come back to that point, so we'll be coming back to that. So point very well taken there. So maybe perhaps, as you mentioned, we academics look at this, we analyze this in various ways as well. Perhaps Dr. Ajay Shah, could I come to you to expand on this a little further?
So everything that Pratibha said resonates with how I think about it, with just one difference. This is a problem faced not just by foreign investors, but by all investors. Okay? So everybody doing business in India today faces the difficulties of an Indian state that intervenes in business activities in many questionable ways. With the rise of an administrative state where legislative and judicial functions are increasingly being given to officials who ultimately obey the present political leadership, whatever it be. Elections come, elections go. Ultimately, officials have tremendous power, and oftentimes legislative and judicial functions are being concentrated with officials. And the third problem, which is a certain erosion of the rule of law. So different people are treated differently, and that generates very high uncertainty. So this is the big question that we face in India today, that how do we become a mature market economy is about addressing these three problems, about creating laws and norms through which the state will retreat from excessive intervention in the country, and restoration of the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary as co-equal branches of government with well-established roles and functions, and great emphasis on the rule of law, of equal treatment, of fair play in how the laws are enforced and implemented against different people. This is a singular question that we face in India today. Private investment in India peaked in 2011. We've been on a decline for 10 years now, and it is not possible to be a high growth country. It is not possible to create jobs without having buoyant private investment. So this is the most important question of the age that all of us should put our minds to.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Shah. I think that would resonate actually with all of us, at this event who have been following the economy as well. That to get to that mature level as an economy, and we have been a high growth economy in the past. We have really sort of been a cynosure really for global economies to look at because of our fast paced growth for quite some time. But then independent of that, we also need to turn into perhaps a mature economy and a mature, have those mature practices, not just in the market, but with the regulators as well. And perhaps that's the next step to be really focusing on. So thank you so much, Ms. Pratibha Jain and Dr. Shah for your inputs on this one. And I think from this very, perhaps it's a slightly generalist and a holistic question. Let's move to maybe a little, let's explore a few more specific aspects of this entire, issue. And I'm going to move, and I'm going to come to Ms. Bhargavi Zaveri with my next question. And this question basically relates to this point that has been observed by many observers and commentators, that in the past we have witnessed what you could say are inconsistent approaches to corporate debt restructuring, right? And corporate debt restructuring has really been top of mind for a while now, given the problems, of non-performing assets, of bad debts, willful defaulters, and so forth. And the judiciary has, in fact, invalidated some regulatory notifications. And at the same time, it appears to be hesitant to interfere in other matters, citing policy decisions. So does this create inconsistency and ambiguity with respect to corporate and commercial issues in India? What's your view, Ms. Bhargavi Zaveri?
Thanks, Professor Shuchi. Pleasure to be here. I think the timing of this question is fantastic. It would have been as good a question on any other day, but particularly now, as we are just emerging from the lockdown and, economic activity has started resuming, and people are now wondering to what extent they can honor their debt obligations versus not, now that the IBC is back in operation, right? So I was thinking we could think about the judicial intervention in debt contract enforcement a little more holistically than just thinking about corporate debt restructuring or the CDR scheme or something like that, right? There are two aspects of intervention that I really wanted to speak about. One is where the judiciary intervenes in contract enforcement. And the second is when the judiciary intervenes in, regulatory actions with respect to corporate debt restructuring. So let's start with the first one. So I thought 2020 was a fantastic experiment in a way. I don't mean to sound insensitive, but what I'm trying to say is all courts generally enforce contracts in the good times. In the good times, I mean, frankly, contract enforcement doesn't even come up much because most people actually like resolving disputes outside the court, and they really come to court when push comes to shove. 2020 was the year where push did come to shove, and we saw a lot of debt contracts being litigated before the courts. Three examples come to mind. Okay, so in the beginning of 2020, March 2020 exactly, there was a case which came up before the court which involved pledge of shares. And if you remember, there was a sharp drop when the lockdown was imposed. There was a sharp drop in the valuation of all asset classes that were being traded in India. Therefore, the loans which actually were secured using equity shares were most precariously located because the value of those equity shares were falling. So the lenders wanted to invoke the pledge as per their contract terms. So one such case was the Future Retail case, where Future Retail shares were pledged, I think, to a particular lender. And the debenture trustee said, look, my bondholders are right now sitting on they're possibly staring at a default because the valuation of the security has dropped drastically, almost by 60%. And they came to the Bombay High Court, and the promoter, the borrower, actually sought an order from the Bombay High Court saying, please do not allow the lender to invoke pledge of shares because actually the valuation of shares has dropped and this is not fair to me. This is where the court's propensity to intervene in contract enforcement was truly tested, right? And what we saw is that in that particular case, the Bombay High Court actually ordered the debenture trustee from not invoking the pledge of shares. This was repeated by the Delhi High Court in a couple of other cases where pledge of shares of infrastructure companies or real estate companies, where pledge of shares was actually stopped by the court, where the court actively intervened and said, no, this is a bad time right now. It will be unfair to the borrower if you actually invoke the pledge of shares as per the contract terms, because the value of the shares had depleted drastically. And we saw this in almost 4 to 5 cases where the judiciary actively stepped in and practically rewrote the terms of the contract. Now note, in at least 3 of these cases, the default was committed in January, before even a single case of COVID was detected in the country. So, it's hard to imagine when the court will intervene in a contract enforcement case versus not. like Pratibha mentioned in the beginning, this is the uncertainty element, right? One is the uncertainty element whether the regulator will seek to regulate something, in what proportion of regulation will be applied. And the second is the court interpretation of contracts itself, where court actually ignores the terms of the contract and says, I don't care what your contract says, I'm going to actually indulge the borrower a bit. All right, so that is one part of it. And I wonder what kind of precedent that sets, because we equally saw examples where after a point, I think after April or May, the court stopped intervening. And the court said, no, but this is RBI's policy. The RBI has given you all a moratorium and we will not intervene and we will not indulge the borrower anymore. So how do parties to the contract know that when the time comes to actually use the security that they have built in for themselves in the contracts, will that security be invoked or not, right? So that's one thing. Then coming to the extent of judicial intervention in executive policy, in matters of executive policy, which is what I think your question is more directly related to. And there, like you rightly mentioned in the beginning, of course, the most canonical case is the compound interest waiver, right? So just to take it sequentially, what happened? There was a moratorium that RBI imposed and announced and said that nobody will be declared a defaulter or if they default on their loans for a certain period, which was extended from, I think, 3 to 6 months. Okay. Then there was a public interest litigation filed before the Supreme Court, and where the relief that was sought was that actually all interest should be waived and people shouldn't be asked to pay interest that accumulates during these 6 months. Eventually, the scope of the waiver was restricted to just compound interest. The Supreme Court went one step beyond, right, and said that, okay, not only what did the Supreme Court do? I think they constituted a committee comprising of central government nominees and I think RBI nominees. I'm not too sure what that committee looked like, but the committee recommended that, look, the central government will absorb the loss for all compound interest that is waived for small ticket size loans. Okay, but beyond that, we will not be able to absorb the loss and people will have to pay as per their loan terms. The court actually rejected that suggestion and said, no, we are going to ask for a waiver of all compound interest, irrespective of the size of the loan. So the extent of loss to be absorbed by the executive, because the central government will have to pay the banks or recapitalize the banks, went up much more, right? So you see those kind of interventions. So there's contract enforcement, and then there is intervention with executive policy. Now, I'm sure this is not a problem that is peculiar to India, right? Everywhere there are regulators, and some of them are financial sector regulators, and all of them enjoy some sort of discretion. And I was wondering, how do courts really interface in other countries which have much more matured judicial systems and more mature regulators? And, if you look at the academic literature here, especially, the legal literature, you find that actually post-2008, courts have started intervening in judicial decisions, in the regulatory decisions much more than what they used to do in pre-2008. So if you look at the United States, at least in the last 2 years, you will see at least 3 big decisions that were taken by a financial sector regulator in the United States, where the court has overturned in or stepped in. But on what grounds? On grounds of due process, on grounds of proportionality, on grounds of, whether a consultation process was done or a cost-benefit analysis was done. Those are the grounds on which those courts have intervened with regulatory decisions. And that is precisely because, like you rightly mentioned, it's inevitable that regulators will exercise discretion. What can you control when this discretion is exercised? You can control the boundaries within which it is exercised. You can measure whether the discretion was proportionate, disproportionate, etc. So one example comes to mind. I'll just spend 2 more minutes on this because then we go back to India, is the MetLife case. So there was this large financial institution which was declared as a systemically important financial institution in the United States, which means that it's subjected to much more regulatory scrutiny. And the court actually overturned that decision, although it was a purely regulatory decision, on the ground that actually you didn't meet due process norms. Now, in coming back to India, it is true that even Indian courts have started intervening in regulatory decisions on grounds of proportionality. So we've seen some fantastic examples last year itself, right? So if you remember the cryptocurrency related prohibition of RBI, where the Supreme Court stuck it down only on the ground of proportionality, right? Similarly, if you the Feb 12 circular that you mentioned, that was struck down, I think, on the grounds of excessive delegation of power, right? So those are due process related grounds. And there again, if you just see sort of the history, you find that courts are much more open to intervening with non-financial sector regulators' decisions than with financial sector regulators' decisions. So, for example, a court has intervened much more with a TRAI or ERA's decision than with an RBI or SEBI's decision. So, if you remember the call drop circular, okay, TRAI had issued a circular saying penalizing telecom companies for call drops. And the court actually said, you haven't done appropriate consultation, and it struck it down. Now, can you imagine a SEBI circular being struck down or an RBI circular being struck down on the ground that there was not enough consultation? I really doubt that would happen. So I think when we talk about judicial intervention, we should, segment it into sort of three. I can think of three sections. There may be more. I may have missed something. One is contract enforcement, and there we find that courts have inconsistently enforced or chosen not to enforce contracts. Second is intervention with executive policy, such as, what does the central government choose to waive versus not, your compound interest waiver. And the third is intervention with regulatory decisions on due process grounds. We have to, once we, compartmentalize these three kinds of judicial interventions, a useful way of then thinking what Indian courts do versus not.
So thank you so much, Ms. Bhargavi Zaveri. And really, I think that was a very, that really gives what you just said. I think that really helps us to look at this in a much more focused way, I would say, and particularly looking at the sort of the way we can differentiate between those interventions on due process, which I think that is what you would expect in a mature market regulator or in a mature markets judiciary, that yes, where there is a due process issue, then that perhaps merits an intervention because there is a consistency in how that would be applied. Whereas on the other two categories, I would say that is where you are wondering in each case how that is going to go, because is it just going to be something that is decided on the issue of, let's say, the public interest or what would be equitable or what seems fair to the parties, or is it going to be on the basis of the policy that is being developed due to the economic developments in the market? So what is it going to be? And I think that is where probably we are looking for a little more consistent growth in terms of intervention being on grounds of process or being on grounds of what the regulation is providing. And that's what the judiciary should be there for, probably, to just look at it that way. So that was very, very interesting. And thank you so much for your inputs there. I was just wondering, Ms. Pratibha Jain, would you have anything to add on that point, on the points that Ms. Bhargavi was speaking about?
I think, all the points she made are very valid. All I'll say is, the reason you don't see that many challenges to RBI SEBI circular is SEBI has its own appellate body, and SAT does tend to overrule a lot of SEBI decisions. So they don't come that much to courts. And RBI, the private sector is just scared of challenging them. So that is purely the reason. It's not that, there is the courts give any more leeway, I think, to the financial regulators. The courts that ways are not very discriminatory between the regulators, at least in India. I think also I do recognize the courts and the need in India for the court to intervene in terms of either due process, proportionality, or even arbitrariness, right? Arbitrariness is also very important. Actually, the CDR circular that was overruled by the Supreme Court was actually something that we all were very happy about. So there is a need for that. I think the recognition, especially the difference between looking at a policy and deciding whether or not the court should intervene is very different from looking at contracts between two parties and overwriting that given the existing laws. If I have made a contract within existing laws of the country, and then for court to intervene on the basis of public interest, it's not really public interest, it's private interest, right? For example, the example in the previous case was on Future. That's a private interest. There's no public interest really there. I think the courts need to really ensure that they distinguish between intervening on policy matters, whereas upholding laws with relation to contracts that have been entered into. I'll stop at that.
Correct. Yeah, no, I absolutely.
Just give me 1 minute, right? So it is absolutely true that there is a Securities Appellate Tribunal, which actually maybe, brings in much more accountability at SEBI than what you would see at RBI, for example. But I want to say one thing. So if you remember in 2016, there was a judgment of the Supreme Court. I think it was a call drop circular judgment itself, where the question was that is a regulator supposed to conduct public consultation? Is it required to conduct public consultation by law? And can a circular be struck down simply because the public consultation conducted was not adequate? And, I think it was Rohinton Nariman's judgment. And he said, look, normally a regulator is not required to conduct public consultation unless the statutory mandate requires it to do it. So unless its governing law requires it to do it. Now, incidentally, the TRAI Act and the ERA Act actually require TRAI and ERA to conduct a public consultation before they issue regulations. Now, we don't find that equivalent in a SEBI or forget banking regulation, or even in a PSS Act. But that tells me that actually, if that mandate is missing, then it is, regulators like the financial sector regulators, which don't have this mandate inbuilt into the law, will likely not be questioned. So that was just a limited point. It is possible that previously they have been questioned and, maybe we're not taking into account those judgments. But it seems like at least the precedent suggests that, a TRAI or an ERA regulation will be held to much more higher standards of scrutiny before the courts than an RBI or SEBI regulation. So just a small point there.
No, a very interesting point as well. And I think that's actually, it's something to perhaps in future also just take note of when we are looking at these kinds of interventions and we are seeing how the court steps in. So very interesting point that, certain regulators are subject to that requirement, let's say for public consultation, whereas others are not. And that also factored into that judicial intervention that you were mentioning. And precisely the point that actually, if we look at SEBI orders, so many of them are overturned at the level of their own appellate tribunal. And I completely agree that in terms of RBI and private sector, very few people would really want to be challenging RBI in particular on its decisions. And, this is something that I can speak to from my background in corporate law. And I spent so many years in a corporate law firm that this was something that all our clients were like, okay, even if there is a question here, let's just accept it and move on. And let's not try and bring any kind of questions about what the RBI is saying. If at all, we wanted to even question it, would be done very gently through some kind of a submission made or something like that. But when it came to challenging the RBI, yes, I completely am with you there that would be something the private sector certainly would not want to get into. So excellent, really wonderful pointers here. So I'm just going to move to the next question. Sorry, yes, please, Dr. Ajay Shah, you had something to add here. Sorry, you're on mute, Dr. Shah.
This is a great discussion. I just want to broaden the scope of what we are doing. I feel that at the foundations, we have some deep difficulties in the way regulators have been established in India. So I find it very concerning when Bhargavi feels that the standard of due procedure for the creation of subordinated legislation at AERA and TRAI is superior to the other regulators in India. I mean, as the people of India, we need to have high quality regulations in all areas. And when checks and balances are lacking, we will get bad quality regulations. Okay. Similarly, it is extremely concerning that people feel afraid to question an RBI order while people are more comfortable questioning a SEBI order. This raises basic questions about rule of law. It is an absolute foundation of liberal democracy that a private person should be comfortable and have efficacious review of orders that are considered wrong or unjust or in any fashion inadequate. It is a very dangerous place for liberal democracy in India if we are afraid to challenge a regulator. So I feel we've got to go to the foundations. That is, the parliamentary law should establish procedures for the legislative and executive functions of the regulators. Every single section that gives a power to a regulator to write regulations needs to clearly articulate what those regulations have to be about and show the balancing considerations where the regulator is expected to find a middle road. There should be no sweeping powers to make regulations. There needs to be due process on how investigations and prosecutions are done. There needs to be a proper hearing where separation of powers, which is in the basic structure of the Constitution, needs to be fully adhered to, and there needs to be an efficacious process for appeal. These are basic foundations of regulation of economics in a mature market economy. And we in India have a problem on all these issues.
Fair enough. Well said. And in fact, sometimes I wonder whether the roots of all this perhaps somewhere lie that originally our economy was, perhaps organized on more socialistic lines, and the let's just call it a philosophical position of the regulator was more about being a little bit paternalistic and looking at the perhaps the interests of what they considered were the ordinary people or the economy as a whole, rather than perhaps the integrity of a particular contract or anything like that. And if we look at the rules or the regulation, like regulatory regimes in the past, which were a great deal more restrictive, I think that's where this whole attitude also of not questioning the regulator or the regulator being seen as a sort of a very larger than life presence on that ecosystem that they are regulating.
There are two phrases that are exactly what you were saying just now. One element is central planning, that in the olden days, the government was supposed to tell all of us what to do. And the second is the whole thought of being subjects and not citizens. When you are a subject, you just accept some maibap, somebody tells you what to do and you obey. But in a liberal democracy, we are citizens and not subjects. And the government is not some absolute feudal power, and obeying the government is not the way to organize a market economy.
Fair, which hopefully there's going to be more movement hopefully in that direction, and our role as people as stakeholders is perhaps to nudge that along from whatever we can do at our end as well. So that's a neat sort of segue into our next question, which in fact, Dr. Ajay Shah, I'm going to come to you for this. So this is more of a this is moving more away from, the approach or the attitude of the regulators or the judicial authorities, more towards another kind of a challenge, right? Which is that there, while we may come up with, good path-breaking ideas on perhaps cutting the clutter in the courts or having specialized fora for different kinds of disputes. But, several of our quasi-judicial authorities, like the debt recovery tribunals, as an example, they have faced severe, I would say, infrastructure constraints, capacity constraints, and therefore there have been a lot of feedback that, they are unable to resolve disputes within the desired timeframes, which was exactly, at the core of why they were set up. So, would you say with this backdrop that these kinds of tribunals are being able to serve their purpose, Dr. Ajay Shah?
You're on mute.
Sorry, you're on mute, Dr. Shah.
Whenever there's a discussion about the judiciary in India, which includes courts, tribunals, and the quasi-judicial hearings that take place inside an organization like SEBI, we should distinguish between two rooms in the house. One is foundations of how a hearing is conducted and questions like judicial independence and so on. And the second is the mundane aspects of operational procedure, of just process engineering, of how documents are handled, about how scheduling is done, and so on. My colleagues and I have actually worked extensively on the second problem, which is about procedures, processes, automation, improved process engineering for the courts. And there are two key elements of intuition that we would like to bring to the table. The first intuition is the intuition of a heart surgeon. Okay, so imagine a judge is like a master craftsman. A judge is like a heart surgeon. Okay, so now how does a heart surgeon work? There's an entire support staff which does an array of the preparatory work on a patient. The patient is made ready, the anesthesia is done, an electric saw is applied to open the chest cavity of the patient. And then at the very last minute, the master craftsman comes in 15 minutes, does her work, and steps away from the operating theater. And then again, the support staff does everything else. So that's the first point, that judges should do the high intellectual work of judging. And there's a whole bunch of process overhead that at present is being placed upon judges, which is not efficient. And please note that one heart surgeon finishes one heart surgery within one session, that we don't fragment it across many sessions, and we don't have many different people coming and doing pieces of the same work. So it just improves the quality if there is focus, that if the entire 4 hours on one case took place as 2 hours on Monday and 2 hours on Tuesday, heard by exactly one bench, you'd get much better outcomes because the mind would focus and it is more feasible for people to actually understand a case, instead of it being dribbled out as 20 hearings where there are different people who are hearing elements of the case. The second big idea in this field is TCS Passport Seva. Okay, all of us have seen the miracle of quality that took place when the operational process engineering of passport applications and passport handling was shifted from mainline government bureaucracy to a dedicated process engineering organization. So civil servants and only civil servants make the decision about whether a person gets a passport or not. But a lot of the processing work is being done by a computer system, being done by a private player. So my colleagues and I have pulled all this together into a proposal that we call ICTS, the Indian Courts and Tribunals Service, which we think of as a process engineering organization that will build and operate the machinery of courts at a high level of efficiency. As an aside, this is the kind of arrangement which is found in most advanced countries, that judges don't do court management, lawyers don't have skills on process engineering. It's a process engineer that knows how to do these things. It's a different skill, and this is the kind of work we need in India also.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that is something which is possibly, it flies a little under the radar, I would say, this kind of problem. The larger sort of, other issues that we were discussing about intervention and, how the court is approaching something or the regulator, that is still being noticed, I feel, a bit more than, and it's really a wonderful input to hear from you that you have done that work on it. Because exactly as you mentioned, that if you look at, for instance, a UK, where you have Her Majesty's Judicial Services, but there's a separate set of services whose job is to do that logistical infrastructure admin work, so that the judiciary is not doing that, right? And I think that's exactly the point that you mentioned. And over and above, of course, the issue of, just the whether the courts have the capacity, whether physical infrastructure is there. Probably it's a twofold issue, that as we have developed these specialized fora, side by side, this is something that perhaps has kind of got lost as a really critical priority, and that needs to be addressed as well if we are really going to increase the efficiency, because exactly as we were saying, the time frames are not being met, and it's not just a factor that there is any kind of inefficiency or unwillingness. It could be precisely this, that judges are also dealing with, or the officials who should be giving orders or hearing the matter are also then looking at the allotment of the matters, or when the timings of the hearings will be, and so forth. So that is definitely something to consider, I think, very seriously moving forward. So that was a great input to get from you. So such a it's wonderful that we are having this very, very vibrant discussion. We do have some more very interesting questions, and time is not that much. I think we've had such a vibrant and dynamic discussion that now there are a couple more very interesting questions that I did want to put to the panel before we take open questions, from everybody gathered here. So I'm going to move on to my next question. Okay, and I'm going to come to Mr. Satyendra Kastia, where, I want to look at now a different aspect, right? Which is that, look, a lot of all of these initiatives are really aimed at improving our ease of business standing and attracting more business into India, right? And so while on one hand, the government is pursuing ease of business, ease of doing business, they're even looking at decriminalization of offenses. If you recollect that proposal that came from the government, that statement of intent that really came from the government about decriminalizing offenses under corporate law. But if you look at it on the other hand, it's a very contrary kind of a position. They are actually looking at introducing new provisions which make directors and senior officers personally liable for non-compliance with regulatory provisions. So do you feel this could have a chilling effect on the innovation, on the and that it could have an economic impact, that there are some quite avoidable compliance costs on particularly, I would say, the startup ecosystem of the country? So, Mr. Kastia, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Thank you. Before I respond to your query, a footnote to what Dr. Ajay Shah has said. We have a very interesting order by the Supreme Court under the Consumer Protection Act, where we have the district commissions and the state commissions. A petition was filed by a citizen saying that there is not adequate infrastructure available to these forums. And again, the capacity and the strength of the benches is not according to the desired level. So I will just read a sentence from the Supreme Court order where they have directed all the state governments. It said, issue notices to all the respondents to show as to how many posts are occupied, how many are vacant, and what is the nature of infrastructure which has been made available as consumer rights are important rights, and non-manning of posts and inadequate infrastructure would deprive the citizens of the redressal of grievances. Now, if this kind of order has been passed by the Supreme Court, converting a petition into a suo motu application, I'm sure this model can be followed with reference to other regulatory or quasi-judicial bodies also, because it's an open secret that we have so many vacancies in practically all possible tribunals and all. Coming to your specific query about the ease of doing business and the decriminalization. By the way, this word ease of doing business has now been added by another phrase, ease of living. And ease of living is mainly for the directors of the company, which again happens to be a part of your second query. So they are basically interrelated. To give you a background, actually, this word decriminalization in the corporate sector came into from company law committee report, which was submitted to the Ministry of Corporate Affairs in the year 2019. And the ministry took quick action, immediately prepared a bill, presented it to the parliament. It was approved in the September 2020, and it has been notified also. Now, pursuant to this bill, the Companies Act now has been amended, and a large number of provisions have been shifted from fine category to the penalty category. And what happens is, when the fine is sought to be imposed for contravention of a particular provision, the matter has to be determined by the court, and then sometimes the imprisonment may also follow. Whereas wherever the penalty has been prescribed, the matter is generally examined and determined by the in-house adjudication mechanism of the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. Of course, you are talking about the corporate law in general, but the moment we talk of corporate law, the first act which comes to our mind is the Companies Act, which is the most important law for a company. Of course, in addition thereto, there are important laws like security laws and tax laws and industrial laws and labor laws and all. But Companies Act is supposed to be the prime act. And I just took a statistics today morning. As on 28th Feb, we were having about 13,29,000 companies. And all these companies are supposed to comply with this huge voluminous act, which is known as the Companies Act 2013. To give you an idea about this law, in this act, we have 500 plus sections. That is a small law. But in this act, we have a very strange term called as may be prescribed. And this term appears in almost 65% of the sections. Now, wherever you have this term as may be prescribed, you have to refer to the relevant rules. We have about 41 rules prescribed and notified under the Companies Act. I'm talking of just one act. And these rules have been amended 219 times in last 5 years. Now, if you have to comply with all these rules which have been amended so many times, and in addition thereto, we have about 170 notifications, about 170 circulars, it becomes a huge body. And as Pratibha as well as Bhargavi suggested, there is an uncertainty about the volume, about the interpretation. When you have such a long document which needs to be complied with, the contraventions are bound to happen. And for that, for the process-related contravention, if the directors are held accountable, it will make the life miserable. And that's why they have come out with this concept of decriminalization based on the report from the Company Law Committee. And practically now, 85 to 90% offenses under the Companies Act have been decriminalized, resulting into imposition of just penalty, which also we gather from the media report that would be a faceless exercise. And if it happens to be a faceless, then again, another fear which Bhargavi advised with reference to RBI, that you are afraid of objecting to certain issues. If the faceless mechanism starts, then again, the fear factor would be gone and perhaps the life would be more miserable. So yes, we are moving from ease of doing to ease of living. But this large volume is definitely creating a problem. And because of this large volume, again, you cannot have one size fits all approach. You have 13,29,000 companies. So, and at times, the time comes when all these companies are supposed to file their documents within a period of 30 days. The whole system practically crashes. The authorities have definitely not taken adequate care of this. And the moment you fail, the penalty starts, which then result into huge fines and all. So there is still a scope for improvement so far as the infrastructure with reference to the Ministry of Corporate Affairs is concerned. Of course, they have announced MCA 03, the third version of changes which are to be brought into MCA system in very shortly. That perhaps would make the things still simpler. Yes.
Correct. Thank you so much, Mr. Satyen Kastia, for your input on the previous query as well. That was very, very interesting to see that point that you made, that if it could be done for one kind of fora, it can certainly be done for the other as well. And yes, I mean, taking into account what you just said in terms of decriminalization and whether that is what we have done so far, is that going to be enough? Because the statement of reason that the government came out with, rather the Ministry of Finance, the Department of Financial Services, Ministry of Finance, in mid 2020 had come out with this statement of reason where there were some 19 acts where they wanted to decriminalize, and this is of course in many ways a very welcome move, although there has been some for instance pushback even on decriminalizing certain offences like section 138 under Negotiable Instruments Act for the bouncing of checks, where many traders are worried about it. So it's not so simple as well, perhaps even from the government side, to really get the entire raft of decriminalization done or accepted. In a democracy, perhaps they're also having to listen to various sides to this question, and therefore whether it is going far enough in terms of really decriminalizing these kinds of compliance matters or financial matters. It may be a complex question in that case, right? That whether enough has been done, that may be a complex question. So as you mentioned, under Companies Act itself, there are so many compliances, or if you, despite this decriminalization initiative that is being taken, if you look at Factories Act or PF Act, or, even sometimes insolvency resolution professionals might find themselves in jail, like we had this case in Uttar Pradesh with JP's resolution professional because of some crash barriers that were not properly installed. So there is some work to be done on it, but probably this is a welcome sort of move in the right direction to get that sort of encouragement without fear. As you said, it's living for the directors and officers as well. So perhaps that's the right step. So thank you so much for that input. In fact, as I mentioned, we do have some really interesting aspects to explore yet, and we've had such wonderful input. So I'm just going to move to the next question for now, because we do have a few really good questions still to come up. And I'm going to move to Ms. Pratibha Jain. And the next question that I want to put to you, it's now we're just going to touch upon this point of a difference, let's say, in the insolvency regime, or let's say a difference in the government or the authorities' approach to insolvency between businesses and individuals, right? So, for instance, the commercial insolvency regime now has been operational for some time, for some years now, and in fact, even a pre-packaged insolvency resolution for medium and small enterprises, micro, medium, small enterprises also has been introduced. But we still have not had a notification on the individual insolvency regime. And therefore, do you feel that the fact that the individual's insolvency regime under the IBC, although if you look at it, that kind of directs you back to the DRT, but do you feel that the fact that it's not yet seen light of day has sort of it's working to prevent individuals from taking enough risks, from doing more entrepreneurship or economic activity? What would be your views on this, the fact that the individual insolvency resolution process is not yet introduced or implemented, and therefore does it have this kind of a chilling effect on the willingness to take risks and do more of entrepreneurial activity, Ms. Pratibha?
Sure, thank you. Actually, just a quick comment on the previous question.
Sure.
The decriminalization by the Finance Ministry was a great welcome move. But practically, it's not the Companies Act that you get pulled under. Very rarely you get for criminal acts pulled under, if it's a Satyam kind of a situation. Most of them, at least the 99% of the cases we are dealing with are under IPC for fraud, for corporate frauds. And you get pulled in either, politically exposed individuals are involved in a case, and then, the investors get dragged in. And there, unfortunately, the move or the position that ED and CBI have been taking is that because there is no individual per se behind the corporation, it's the directors who we are going to name. And not only the directors who were directors at the time that the alleged offense happened, but the current directors. So even if you were not there at the time of the alleged offense, and you're a director in a company now that gets somehow pulled into a IPC case, you're getting named, and sometimes getting named even in the charge sheet. So that kind of, and we, in certain of these cases, went to CBI and said that is not the current law of the land. There are Supreme Court judgments saying that you can't do that. There has to be a prima facie case against the individual to be named. And yet that's the position that they are taking. So how do you deal with that kind of uncertainty? So a lot of people, including lawyers, are saying we are just not going to get on boards because we know really where the liability can arise. And in those situations, the cases don't get resolved. In India, the other problem is the criminal cases just don't get resolved. They don't go away. There's neither conviction nor are you acquitted for decades at end. So sorry, just on that the real pain in that point. On the individual insolvency, I totally agree with you. Very valid question. Just based on my years of experience in the US as a US lawyer, the innovation there thrives on the fact that you can fail. That concept doesn't exist in India. If you fail, there are legal ramifications, of course, reputational ramifications. We don't have the concept of, yes, you could have, started a business and actually failed. It was a very welcome move when IBC had the provision for that. But I think the current provisions are also a little scary because, the threshold is very low. It's only, I think, 60,000 rupees, where somebody else can take you. So just like, in the home buyers case, we saw a lot of extortion happening. This can lead to extortions for individuals. So I think tweaking is required, but at the same time, I think voluntary insolvency by individuals need to be notified as soon as possible. I think if Startup India, Make in India, all of these have to actually thrive, I think this piece of legislation is required to be notified.
Correct. I mean, and I think that point that you made, that already we can look to existing regimes for this. Your point about, for instance, the US regime, where yes, there is it can be a very intimidating situation to be in, but there's a fixed process, right? That once you declare that personal bankruptcy, at the end, there is a fixed process you have to follow at which you are debt free. Right. So there is a route to that, and it may be a slightly difficult route or even a slightly intimidating route, but there is a route to that. So, that could be something that is helpful in the Indian context as well. And I think what again would probably be the need perhaps is to make it very non-judicial and more of an administrative process, that there is a process to follow. You make that application and you get there.
The problem is, in India, there will be, unfortunately, it's a new legislation, right? So if you make it administrative, there will be fraud, there will be people who will take loans. And so we will go through that teething process. I think there is no doubt that, there will be cases that are not genuine. But that does not mean that we don't enable the genuine cases and, learn to separate the two. So it'll get there, and there will be pains and that's why I think they're scared to notify it.
Correct. So Dr. Ajay Shah, it will be great to get your inputs as well on this.
I agree with everything Pratibha said, and she made a fascinating comment. People with knowledge of law think twice before they become a board of directors. Okay, I have one criminal case because of some experience on being a board of directors, so I know I've lived the story that she just said. I want to enhance this argument one step further. If you think of the old entrepreneurial culture of India, okay, you think of 50 years ago, 100 years ago, amongst business communities in India, there was a very comfortable and optimistic approach towards business failure. And the business failure is a part of life. That you try things, you fail, and you fail 5 times, and you figure it out, and on the 6th time you get it right. I feel what Pratibha just said is absolutely key to protecting entrepreneurship in India, because the way things are currently structured, if a person will try to build a business once and there is debt in the picture, and then things go badly, and that person's life is then chewed up for 5-10 years. So first of all, at a very critical age in the life of that person, 5-10 years are wasted in resolving the debt that could not be paid. And second, it leaves a bad taste, and the person is then less likely to do entrepreneurship. Actually, the learning by doing of entrepreneurship is key. Nobody is born a great entrepreneur. You have to try again. So I feel there's a huge problem that we need to create a world where it is not dangerous and it is not an unpleasant thing to attempt building a business. What we are doing in India is we are making it extremely unpleasant. So only a few people will try it. And if it fails the first time, you're then unlikely to try a second time. That's extremely costly for economic dynamism.
Very, very fair. Point well taken, Dr. Shah. So, I think this is something that deserves some attention and some analytical thought into what should be the best mode to encourage that entrepreneurship and that risk taking. Definitely agree with it. A great discussion so far, and we still have some very good questions to consider. So I'm just going to move on and, just a gentle request. Let's try and get through some of these other questions as well. We do have some excellent questions from the audience, and it's wonderful to see that engagement as well. But very quickly, let's get through a couple more questions with the panel, and then I'll take questions, from the audience as well. So my next question to Ms. Bhargavi, that and let's look at the fact that there is a suspension sometimes of this corporate insolvency resolution process. And while the basic underlying cause is absolutely understandable. So for instance, in light of the pandemic, the corporate insolvency process was suspended, but this kind of an approach, which is applied very uniformly without taking into account specificities of each matter, it's almost like a sledgehammer approach. Do you feel this would do more harm than good to the economy, Ms. Bhargavi?
Thanks. So it is true that with with lockdowns, etc., every country experienced some sort, except perhaps the United States, experienced some sort of tweaking of their bankruptcy law or a suspension, nature of a suspension sort of a thing, coupled with a moratorium, right? But I just want to take a step back and think a little bit about what is the purpose of a bankruptcy law, right? The purpose of a bankruptcy law is that actually when a person is facing financial distress, what are the creditors likely to do? Each creditor is likely to pursue her own self-interest. So imagine you are at the start of a lockdown, you are a manufacturing unit, and you don't know until what point the lockdown will continue, and you have loans to pay. You have employees, you have suppliers, you have a couple of maybe financial creditors. What is each one likely to do in the absence of a bankruptcy law? Each one is going to try and recover the full amount that is due to her, right? So, for example, if it's a secured creditor, he's most likely to enforces security, and maybe it's not a good time to sell then, but maybe he will still choose to sell because who knows how long this is going to continue, right? So the purpose of a bankruptcy law is to really bring all the creditors onto the table and preempt each creditor from taking self-interested actions that may actually reduce the overall recovery for the whole body of creditors. Now, when you take away the bankruptcy law, you actually take away the incentives to come to the negotiation table, and you are likely reducing the overall recovery that could have been made if each creditor wouldn't have pursued their own self-interest, right? So the bankruptcy law is triggered. And in our case, of course, the board is suspended. But more importantly, all the creditors come to the table and decide whether this is financial distress or this is economic distress. That is it likely that this is just a function of the lockdown, in which case the creditors are not likely to pursue their individual recovery routes. They are in fact likely to want to save the firm as a going concern, because each creditor actually recovers a little more by saving the firm as a going concern, as opposed to going and liquidating the only asset that he has, which may a standalone equipment or a standalone machinery. It is not likely to face the same value as when a factory is sold, when a factory is running and is doing business, right? So when you take away that bankruptcy law, you reduce the incentive for any creditor to come to the table, and you actually deprive the debtor of this, opportunity of getting a reset with everybody else. So I think what we lost sight of was the fact that the bankruptcy law is here to help debtors as much as it is here to help creditors. In the absence of a bankruptcy law, the debtors are at the mercy of creditors, or at the mercy of each creditor, most likely their largest secured creditor. All the creditors are at the mercy of the largest creditor because they don't know what is the largest creditor going to do. The employees have no clarity on when are their dues likely to be paid, even if with a haircut. So to come back to your question, yes, the sledgehammer approach, in my opinion, was excessive. It was maybe even inappropriate. One way of doing this, which is what I think many nations actually ended up doing, is you suspend creditor filings. You allow the debtor at least to file the voluntary, your Section 10 filings, etc. So that if the debtor is able to arrive at some sort of a settlement or resolution with his creditors, they have the choice to take that legal route and actually restructure their debts under the shadow of a law, as opposed to each creditor guessing what is the other guy going to do, or as opposed to the debtor going and pleading to each creditor that just hang on, just let's us tide over these 3-4 months, and at the end of 6 months, I'll pay you whatever was due with interest, right? So yes, I think we should have learned from what other countries did, which is that maybe creditor filings it was appropriate to suspend them, but the debtor filing route could have been kept alive for sure.
I think that's a good way to see how this could have been balanced, perhaps. That yes, while it was understandable to take that step, perhaps the other aspect of it, the interest of the debtors, creditors, both being a little bit more in balance, what could have been done, maybe that was something to take into account. And in fact, Ms. Bhargavi, the next question also had to you, and I think after we've had your take on it, I'll probably ask a couple more of the panelists to quickly give their view as well. And I just request a little patience from the audience because these questions are so good and we do want to take the audience questions, but we'll take a few minutes more and just finish off with our panelists' questions, and then we'll move on to the audience questions. And I do realize we are short of time, so we'll try and wrap this up really, really quickly. So I'm just going to move to the other question, and then I'll take a response perhaps from one of the other panelists as well, which is that the question that I wanted to come to is that a lot of this debt recovery process, I would say really a large portion of it, the attention is really to the private sector's debts and how that is being enforced or recovered. But there is very often a huge liability of public sector or of government regulatory bodies to clear their dues in time, right? And this has a knock-on effect. It very often has a domino effect on the inability of the private sector, right, to repay their dues, right? But this, as an example, in that Dhani Sugars case, we saw the power sector, the power producers facing a lot of distress because the DISCOMs were in distress, which are public bodies or government bodies, and because they could not pay the power producers, they went into distress. So there is a knock-on effect from the public sector to the private sector, but a structural reform to push for public sector firms to make these kind of timely repayments has not yet been introduced. So in a sense, you could almost say it's a kind of a preferential treatment to the public sector. And does this do more harm than good for the economy, Ms. Bhargav?
So I'll just quickly, you're absolutely right. And this is a problem, like I keep saying, it's not unique to India. Everywhere, public sector bodies are known, or public authorities are known to let's just say, abuse their large negotiating power and delay payments. And still people keep doing business with the public sector simply because it's a lot of volumes or for whatever other reason, right? So I think in the MSME Act, a couple of reforms have been attempted where, a statutory interest payment has been provided for delayed payments. Public sector, every person who owes, every business who owes money to a micro or small or medium enterprise and is not paying its dues on time is supposed to report delayed payments. I mean, there are some compliances, etc. And the whole objective of this exercise is to generate transparency on how disciplined a payer are you, right? Because once you have that level of transparency, and I'm afraid insolvency law cannot fix the problem of public sector enterprises making late payments, right? Similarly, company law cannot fix it. What can fix this problem? In my opinion, it's about the counterparty factoring in the possibility of getting this delayed payment and factoring it in his cost of doing business with the government, right? But so, for example, when a private firm makes a bond issuance, or when you basically the risk that you attribute to that private firm is directly linked to his payment discipline. We are not able to do this with government. Why? Because government accounts are hard to understand. A government department, financials, you don't really take it into consideration how delayed they are. Sometimes you don't even have the information of how disciplined a payer one government department is versus another. For example, is an urban local body, a panchayat, a municipal body, more disciplined in making payments than the central government? I don't know. I cannot say. Is Maharashtra government more disciplined in making payments, or is the UP government more disciplined in making? I don't know. I can't say. Right? It's hard. So except unless you are a person who deals with that government on a repeat basis, it's very hard to say how disciplined a government department is in making those payments. The point is, you have to incentivize, you have to force government departments to disseminate information about their payment discipline, because it is the only way to reduce the information asymmetry between the government and a counterparty who deals with it. Right? And then next time when I'm a vendor to the government, I will factor that in, that this guy has been paying late consistently. Why? Because I can see it in public information. He has been mandated to disclose, and I will increase the cost at which I price that contract in. And that kind of turns into a feedback loop for that government department, who in turn will be questioned that why is it that your contracts turn out to be so much more expensive? That's one way to sort of deal with this problem, because clearly providing statutory interest payments in the law, etc., I'm not sure if it really makes a difference. There is research to suggest in the EU, where such similar laws exist, that it makes no difference on payment discipline. Disclosure, the disclosure mandate has made a much more difference on payment discipline than the requirement to pay statutory interest.
A very fair point. And yes, I absolutely take on board the point that it's not an India-specific issue. Probably with public sector enterprises, in many jurisdictions, we would see similar issues. The dilemma is then how to find some way to correct this very disproportionate, I would say, negotiating power and volume that the government represents, and therefore the private sector wants to work with them despite these issues. And also the problem of really trying to do some kind of a provisioning exercise of factoring in the delayed payments, whether all of the private sector would be in a position to do this. So, but very, very good points. And before we move on to our last question, and then I'll be taking audience questions. So we are almost there. I just wanted to very quickly check if one of the other panelists wants to give a very short response. Mr. Surendra Kanstiya, would you have any inputs at all that you have on this point of private sector being the main sector on which debt recovery has hinged, but the public sector also has a lot of unpaid dues at any given time? Or would you like to talk about the fact that, the suspension of the corporate recovery process, whether that was too much of a blanket approach? Would you have any anything to add? No?
Okay, I'm sorry.
Okay,
I have a previous commitment at 2:00, so I'm going to log off.
Sure.
Thank you very
Absolutely.
much for this amazing discussion. Thanks.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Ms. Pratibha. It was absolutely a pleasure to get your insights, and thank you so much for sparing time to join us. So thank you so much. So I'm just going to move on to the last question before we move to the audience questions. Now, this is a question for Dr. Ajay Shah. And here we'll just take on the point that, if you look at the way the insolvency and bankruptcy code has developed in practice, if we look back to, let's say, the SR case, 2016-17, phoenixing, where the promoters wanted to come back and perhaps be one of the applicants to take the company. So there has been a kind of observation that the IBC, Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, tends to suffer from, you could say, a promoter-averse approach, and then maybe a bias towards liquidation, although on the face of it, the statute is really all about preserving the operations or finding a resolution other than liquidation. So, and apart from that issue, there is also some kind of ambiguity around the classification of consumer groups as creditors. So the example that came up early in our discussion of home buyers, flat buyers in real estate projects, who have this dispute that they have paid the money and not received the houses. The classification of those kinds of consumers as creditors. Do all of these ambiguities, are they just a part of the evolution of the bankruptcy regime, or can they be avoided? Could they have been avoided through more stakeholder consultation, through more assessment of the regulatory impact? So, Dr. Ajay Shah, leaving this question open to you.
I can't see him on the screen. I'm not sure.
Oh, sorry. Is he? Okay, perhaps Dr. Shah has logged off. So in that case, Ms. Bhargavi Zaveri, would you like to take a crack at this question before we close out the panel discussion?
Sure, can take a crack at it. Okay, so I'll just divide your question into two parts, right? The first one you mentioned, that is the code really promoter averse or liquidation friendly? And the second is that what do we do about these special cases of consumers being classified as financial creditors and so on? Let's take the first part, right? So actually, if you go to see, the court disagrees with you overwhelmingly, right? The courts, if you see the Supreme Court's judgment in whether it is, I think, what is that case? Swiss Ribbons. I think it was the SR case, where the court actually says that under the code, if you read the language of the code, liquidation is the ultimate last option. And actually the code, the first objective of any resolution professional should be to reorganize, because actually the code heavily relies on the language in the preamble, which uses resolution, but doesn't use the term liquidation. And therefore the court says that actually liquidation is the absolute last option. So the interpretation of the court is very different from what may be perceived as the factual reality. So I wouldn't say that there is a liquidation bias that is built into the code. I wouldn't say that there is a resolution bias that is built into the code. Actually, if you read the code as it is, there is no bias that is built into the code. It eventually leaves all decision-making to the creditors, because actually they know best what is to be done with the assets of the firm, with the employees of the firm, with the contracts of the firm. And the decision-making was, I think in its original, if you look at the report of the Bankruptcy Law Reforms Committee, was left only to the creditors. Subsequently, I think there was a section 29A that was added to the code, which you could argue brought in an anti-promoter bias, because promoters were excluded, not really promoters, but willful defaulters and their related parties were excluded from applying in the resolution process with a bid for taking over the firm in the resolution process, because the apprehension was that there is a moral hazard, that if you allow the firm to be taken to resolution, and then if you allow the bad promoter who did not pay you to bid for the assets of the firm, then, it creates incentives to actually default deliberately and, take back your firm at a much lower price. Right. So that is where actually the anti-promoter bias came in. And I think there is some logic to why we have the anti-promoter bias. I mean, in society, because we have actually seen Indian promoters and Indian businesses being shown indulgence by the banking sector over a very long period of time, and that creates natural apprehensions and anxiety for what the promoters would do to get their firm back. But I think at some point we have to decide, either we can have clarity in the law, and we can actually say that, resolution is agnostic to who takes over the firm. If at that point in time, the creditors believe that the promoter is the only person who will buy back the firm and who will clear that debt, so be it, right? Or we can choose to stick with, our old experience of how promoters may, sort of be incentivized to take the firm, strategically default and take the firm to insolvency and then take over the firm at lower rates. Right? So I think it's a trade-off. Right now, our society has made this trade-off where they think that promoters should be kept out of the bidding process. Willful defaulters should be kept out of the bidding process. It's a trade-off that we've chosen to make. But as the court's interpretation is that there is a resolution bias, you are saying that the reality on the ground is that there is a liquidation bias. I would say that if you actually read the letter of the law, it's left to the creditors. I don't think there is a bias one way or the other, and you will find that in the logic of the code in the Bankruptcy Law Reforms Committee report.
Correct.
On the second point, I honestly don't have views on whether buyers of home buyers should be treated as financial creditors versus operational, because I think it's a function of the way the real estate financing structures evolved in India, which essentially allowed the entire projects to be funded with just advances from home buyers, right? I mean, given that was the financing structure at that point in time, maybe it's only fair to say that home buyers were not just consumers, they were actually lenders to projects. But now with RERA coming in, right, exactly, which requires some sort of ring fencing of the advances that is taken from home buyers, maybe we won't have that problem, or we will be able to mitigate the risk of those advances being used and siphoned off. And maybe this is a legacy issue. So I don't particularly have a view on the second question.
Okay. Thank you so much. I mean, that was really a very, very illuminating, set of points that you made out there. And it's a fair point that the statute itself doesn't really have any kind of a in-baked sort of a bias. It's more how it would be implemented that we'll see some kind of pattern emerging from there. So very fair point. I'm well aware that we've had such a dynamic discussion. We've exceeded our time that we had planned to do the panel discussion. I'll take a quick input. Professor Srijit, do you think we can take a couple of questions from the audience, or we are short of time? Okay, my apologies for this. We had two questions that I really wanted to take from the audience, but we are really unfortunately short of time, and we have a fantastic panel right after this. So, we'll have to log on here, and thank you so much to everybody who has joined to come in and listen to us in our discussion today on these very, very interesting points of, interlinkage between law and economic analysis and law and economic imperatives. And I thank all our panelists for joining us, taking out time from their busy schedules. Thank you all so much. And, we will have to end our discussion in this panel event right now, and we'll be having our next panel. So we look forward to seeing all of you in the next discussion as well. And thank you so much for the panelists. It was a great pleasure to get your insights today. Thank you so much.
Same here. Bye-bye.
Thank you, panelists. Thank you, moderator. So I also thank everyone who has been connected to us through the JGU YouTube channel. for our third technical session, Law and Economics Approach to Competition Policy, Digital Economy and New Technologies. Please stay connected. We'll commence in the next couple of minutes. Thank you, everyone.